Hello and welcome to the very first part of my Silent Hill review marathon, where we're going to be taking a look at Silent Hill 1 through to Silent Hill 4. The reason that I want to concentrate on these games rather than the ones that were released afterwards is that, at least for now, I just want to concentrate on the games that were made by the original developers before the series got handed over to Western developers, starting with Silent Hill Origins. As for why I suddenly want to take a look at these games now after all this time, well, it's because I've come down with a severe case of Silent Hill scary shaky-itis. In fact, I think I can feel a bout of it coming on now. Whoa! Thank God that's over. After looking up this illness online, I've discovered the only way of getting rid of it is to play through all 4 of the original Silent Hill games. So, join me as we take a look at the first game released in the series with Silent Hill for the PS1. My history with the Silent Hill series is practically non-existent. I never played any of the Silent Hill games when they first came out, and my experience with them consists of nothing more than playing the openings of the first 2 games, and then getting distracted by something else, and never continuing them. The most I've played a Silent Hill game is actually with PT, which as everyone knows at this point was a playable teaser for the cancelled Silent Hills game, which was going to be developed by Hideo Kojima before it was cancelled by Konami. I can't even begin to explain how much I love PT. I did a whole video devoted to it a few years ago, and I consider it to be one of the best video games ever made, and it's not even a proper game. So obviously, after loving PT and being a big fan of psychological horror in general, it only makes sense for me to check out the other games in the series. It's a little bit weird how I've not already played the Silent Hill games, to be honest, because they seem right up my alley. I think the reason I've never played any of them is because I was just never introduced to them by anybody that I know, and I've never known anybody in person who's talked about them that passionately either. But still, hopefully my inexperience with this series will make for an interesting set of videos, because I'm going into them, playing them for the first time ever, and with no nostalgic attachment to them either. Silent Hill opens with a cutscene which shows the protagonist of the game, Harry Mason, driving down a road with his daughter, Cheryl Mason. A police officer riding a motorbike overtakes him, and after a while of driving, he spots that the bike has clearly gone out of control and crashed, and the officer is nowhere to be seen. Continuing to drive, he swerves out the way of a girl who suddenly appears out of nowhere in the middle of the road, and he joins the party that the police officer started by crashing into the side of a cliff. Harry wakes up sometime later to discover that his daughter has disappeared, and the game begins with him looking for her in the foggy town of Silent Hill. The opening cutscene is a bit weird because as well as showing the events I've just talked about, it also keeps cutting to other characters that we haven't been introduced to yet. It's a bit jarring and it makes it difficult to understand what's going on, what bits we're actually supposed to be paying attention to, and what's actually happening in the present day. While I get it's probably supposed to be a bit disorientating because that's just the nature of Silent Hill, I probably would have preferred to have just had a normal cutscene showing Harry crashing the car, rather than having all of these other out of context shots of these characters from later on in the game. That aside though, I actually really like this plot setup. We're already asking ourselves loads of questions, like what happened to that police officer from earlier, and where did Cheryl go? And this gives us the motivation to keep going with the game, to find out the answers to those questions. After a while of chasing after Cheryl, who seems to be running away from us through the fog, we enter an alleyway in one of the most iconic moments of the series. This moment alone sets the tone for the rest of the game and manages to instantly separate itself from its horror contemporaries like Resident Evil by being a lot more stylish with its disorientating moving camera and its very slow build-up, which reinforces the much more psychological aspect this game is going for. Basically, as Harry navigates the alley, the world suddenly plunges into darkness as a siren distantly blazes. Using nothing but a lighter to guide his way, things instantly don't seem right. A wheelchair lies overturned, squeaking away as its wheel spins, implying that someone was literally just there to have spun it in the first place. A bloody corpse on a hospital bed covered with a blanket has been abandoned, and this all culminates in reaching the end of the path, where a body has been strung up with barbed wire and appears to have been mutilated and disemboweled. All the while, the background ambience ramps up, introducing metallic industrial scraping, which is extremely unnerving. You're then ambushed by a group of monsters and completely cornered as the alleyway behind you has closed itself off. Wow. I mean, you've got to hand it to the developers. This has got to be one of the most impressive introduction sequences to a horror game that I've ever played. There's a lot going on in this one single scene that's extremely impressive, and all of these elements remain as common tropes throughout the entire game. Firstly, the music here is absolutely incredible. This is by far the most unsettling soundtrack I've ever heard in a horror game before, maybe aside from PT's. Then there's the lighting effects, which are absolutely astonishingly good for a PS1 game. With you having access to the lighter, and for the rest of the game a torch, the lighting is actually very dynamic, casting shadows at whatever you're pointing your light source at, and sending things in your peripheral vision into total darkness. This is easily the best lighting I've ever seen in a PS1 game, and I've played a lot of PS1 games, let me tell you. But then another impressive thing is that while the game makes use of fixed camera angles for its interior sections, it isn't just completely static like in Resident Evil, and the camera will tilt and move to track where you are. You also have a degree of control over the camera by being able to swing it around behind Harry so that you can see whatever's in front of him. So it has the fantastic direction of Resident Evil with the way they are able to frame shots like it's a film, but it also has the control of a video game camera, which enables you to get a proper feel of what the environments look like in 3D space, as well as having a gameplay benefit by allowing you to see where enemies are if they're off screen. And what's insane is that this all actually works extremely well. You'd figure this would be a bit clunky with this being the first game of the entire series and being on the PS1, but they actually nailed it the first time around. As with Resident Evil, because some of the game consists of fixed camera angles, Silent Hill uses tank controls. While a lot of people don't like this, I really think it works here because pressing up will always move you forward, and left and right will always rotate you on the spot, regardless of the camera angle you're looking at. If the game used analog controls or made it so that pressing up made you actually move up on the screen, you'd become disorientated whenever the camera angle changed because up might no longer be the same direction that it was on the previous angle. It's a little bit difficult to explain what I mean, but hopefully that makes sense. Basically, by having tank controls, the movement is always consistent, with up moving Harry forward in the direction he's facing rather than where the camera is pointing, and it makes navigation feel very intuitive. Plus, we have some very nice quality of life improvements made to the Resident Evil tank controls, in the way that Harry can quick turn on the spot and he can also sidestep too. The quick turn-in is genuinely really helpful, and when I learned this was a thing, my experience became so much better. But the sidestepping is a little bit useless. You can't do it while already moving forward, so in order to sidestep you need to be completely static anyway. But in that case, you might as well just rotate on the spot and move where you want to go normally. I think the sidestepping came in handy one time in the whole game where I killed this guy in a kitchen, so yeah, I guess it's nice to have, but it's not really all too helpful. Anyway, I think it's about time that we catch up with Harry's story and learn what happened to him after he was killed in that alleyway earlier in the game. So, Harry wakes up in a diner, seemingly having dreamt the whole nightmare scenario up in his mind. He was found by the police officer from earlier, who introduces herself as Sybil Bennett. She says she's gonna try and find a way out of the town to call for backup after Harry tells her his daughter is missing, but before she goes, she gives him a gun to defend himself with. Which, to be honest, is a little bit weird because I don't think Sybil has seen any monsters at this point, and if she has, then why the hell is she leaving Harry on his own? Is this just normal for Sybil, handing out firearms to everyone she meets? If so, she probably should have a cop license revoked. Regardless of that, it's good for us because we now have a way of defending ourselves, and we also find some health pickups and a knife nearby too. Attempting to leave the diner causes a nearby radio to start outputting static interference, and just as Harry investigates, a friggin' flying demon blasts through the window. Alright, let's limber up. This is our first proper combat encounter. Let's go. Huh. Yeah, I got wrecked by the first proper enemy in the game. Not even just one time either, this happened twice. So I had died twice before the game had even started, which is a great sign of things to come. The reason for this though is simply due to me not understanding how combat worked properly yet. I was trying to conserve all of my ammo and use the knife to kill the creature, but really what I should have done is just shot the thing to death. I was playing on normal difficulty, and I actually found that the game gives you a lot of ammo. Like, realistically, so long as you kill some enemies with melee attacks, you're not gonna run out of bullets. So yeah, don't be trying to save every last bit of ammo you come across, because you're just making life a lot more difficult for yourself. Lesson learned. Upon leaving the diner, we're thrown into our first proper gameplay style, which is the open, explorative sections. These sections are really cool because the camera isn't fixed and simply follows you like it would with any normal 3D game. This is really good because it keeps things feeling really varied, going from the tighter fixed camera angles to this more open style. What's more is that this is actually kind of an open world to explore. You're given a map and a clue as to what your destination is, but it's fully up to you how you want to get there and if you want to go and explore first. I do wish that these sections had a lot more going on, because really, there's not a lot to do here. Sure, you'll come across some ammo every now and then, but it's a bit of a shame that there wasn't some more optional buildings to enter, or maybe more side missions you could do. As far as I'm aware, there's only one side mission that's completely optional in the entire game, and it happens much, much further on. Which is a shame because I would have liked to have learned more about Silent Hill and explored more of it in these sections. Still, credit where it's due, it's still pretty impressive that there's a massive open area to explore at all, considering that this is a PS1 game. Also, I know this is pointed out in literally every video about this game ever made, but using the fog as an actual in-universe thing to create anxiety about what lies ahead of you, as well as to increase the general spooky feel of Silent Hill, is a stroke of genius. Obviously, the technical reason for the fog is just to hide things loading into the game and popping into existence when you get close. But the fact the developers used this limitation of the hardware and turned it into something that adds something to the game is a great touch, and there's a reason it's mentioned in literally every single video about Silent Hill. The basic objective of these open sections is to get to the next, what I guess could be considered, level of the game. So you'll often need to follow a vague hint as to where the next area is and use your map to figure out where to go, or sometimes you'll need to find certain items to allow you to unlock the way forward. While you're exploring and looking for the way forward, there's a lot of enemies that will be chasing you down, and I actually think this could have been toned down a lot. The monsters in these open areas become more of a nuisance than actually scary, and the best course of action is always to simply run away from everything. I feel like I want to take my time and soak in the atmosphere, but I'm constantly being slapped around by a flying demon, so I'm just constantly running, and it would have been more scary to have had hardly any creatures here, rather than having loads and me becoming completely desensitized to them this early on. It's when you get to the actual interior levels though that Silent Hill really begins to stand out. The first one of these you'll come across is the school, which Harry goes to after finding a drawing left behind by his daughter. These areas basically feel like smaller versions of the mansion from Resident Evil 1, where you need to solve puzzles to get key items to unlock your way further into the building until you find whatever it is that you're looking for. Of course, there's also a lot of combat here too, and a lot of exploration, which can be difficult due to the maze-like level design. The combat in Silent Hill is actually really good, and far better than the combat in Resident Evil in my opinion. The reason for this is that not only do you have the standard shooting gameplay, where you ready a weapon and shoot from a distance, which is actually better in Silent Hill because you can actually move while aiming, but there's a whole other element on top of that with the melee combat. This isn't just a little afterthought like in Resident Evil either. You could actually say that the melee combat here is the main form of combat, and I killed far more enemies up close and personal than what I did with a gun. It took me a while to properly get the hang of this because I didn't know what was going on at the start of the game, but basically, by tapping the X button, Harry will swing whatever it is he's holding quickly, causing less damage but having a wider radius and having less of a wind-up animation. But what you really want to do is be much more methodical and hold the X button to charge up your attack, which causes more damage and can stun enemies too. At the start of the game I didn't know this strong attack was a thing, but when I figured it out, it was really satisfying smacking monsters to death, and the hammer became my overall weapon of choice throughout the game from that point on. Despite using a melee weapon being a lot more risky than using a gun due to having to get so close and time your attacks right to avoid leaving yourself open, it has the benefit of not using up any ammo, so there's an excellent balance between the guns and melee weapons. Where the combat begins to fall apart a little bit is when there's more than a single enemy on screen. While it feels great in one-on-one situations, when there's a small group of enemies, it's practically impossible to avoid getting hit. You can only lock onto one enemy at a time, but obviously this leaves you wide open to being attacked by the monster you're not currently facing. You might say, well, you can run away and create a bit of distance between you and the monsters, but this isn't really possible due to how cramped the levels are, combined with the tank controls not being great for quick and precise movement. Plus, the monsters themselves are pretty fast, so you'll probably end up taking even more damage if you try this tactic. I'm not exactly sure what the solution to this issue is though. If there was always only a single enemy at a time, it would become predictable. So they needed to have groups sometimes, but the game just doesn't quite manage to handle this properly. All in all though, the combat here is really good. In fact, it's probably one of the best combat systems that I've ever seen in a traditional survival horror game like this. It's slow and methodical, and it has you constantly making the decision between risking a close-ranged attack or using up some of your ammo. But, as we all know, there's a lot more to Silent Hill than the combat. One of the other main elements of Silent Hill is the puzzle sections. So let's take a look at this one in the school level. We have a piano and we have a riddle on the wall. Some of the keys on the piano don't work and some do. So I guess we need to press the keys in a certain order. Maybe just press all of the keys that don't work all in a row? Okay, so that didn't work. So maybe we just need to take a closer look at the riddle that's on the wall? First flew the greedy pelican, eager for the reward, white wings flailing. Then came a silent dove, flying beyond the pelican as far as he could. A swan glides in to find a peaceful spot. Finally, out comes a crow, coming who will show the way. Alright, that's enough. This puzzle is driving me insane. It's making me want to just... Okay, so yeah, in the end, I looked up the solution to this puzzle. Not because I never would have figured it out, but because this is at a pretty early stage of the game, and I feel like I hadn't quite worked out the logic of how the puzzles worked yet. I was thinking that maybe I would find a music sheet in another area or something, so I didn't want to spend hours mashing random keys, only to find that I had to come back later. It turns out though that the riddle on the wall actually implies the order of the keys you're supposed to press, with the white birds being white keys and the black birds being black keys, and their flight patterns suggesting where the keys are positioned. I would imagine that a hell of a lot of people who played this game back when it came out got stuck here and never got past this point. While I think that this puzzle is actually really good now I know how to do it, it's far too difficult for this early in the game. But other than this notoriously difficult puzzle, I would say that the rest of the puzzles in the game are actually really great. There's another standout one that I was really happy to solve on my own, where there's pictures of different creatures on the walls and a number underneath them. Then there's 3 more pictures where you need to input a number by working out the logic of why the other pictures have their specific numbers. I'm going to put the pictures that have numbers on the screen so that you can see if you can work it out for yourselves. So what do you think the correlation is here? Pause the video here if you want to take more time, because the solution turned out to be the amount of arms and legs that each creature has. Even though this might well be super obvious to some people, I felt like a genius when I figured this out. And a lot of the puzzles make you feel like that too. They're not so easy that it's unrewarding, but they're never so difficult that it's impossible to work it out by using logical thinking. I actually really enjoyed the puzzle sections in Silent Hill, which is a pretty big deal because I can sometimes feel like survival horror puzzles become a bit tedious, but that isn't the case at all here. Now, you may think that I've run out of positive things to say, but actually I've been saving my favourite thing about Silent Hill until last. And that thing is the exploration. While the exploration of the actual town can feel maybe a little bit pointless at times due to there not being enough side things to do or optional places to explore, the exploration of the interior sections is by far one of the best things about the game. This is where the horror in survival horror rears its head, and while I won't say that the game is outright scary, it's definitely very creepy. Like Resident Evil, Silent Hill's interior levels are quite maze-like, and you'll be needing to find the right way forward, which will lead you to a key item, which you'll then use to open up new paths by backtracking. What stops this from being completely overwhelming is that the levels are actually fairly small, and you'll open up shortcuts which lead back to familiar areas that almost feel like a hub. You also have access to a really good map, which is interesting in the way that it will start out by just looking like any normal map, but then when you come across a locked door, for example, Harry will write on the map and cross out the door. Or another example is if you come across a key area, like the room that had the piano in that I mentioned earlier, he'll write down that that's where the piano is. It not only makes navigating really easy, but it also makes sense in universe because you have to actually find the maps and do the exploring before the map gets properly filled in. I actually completely missed the map in the hospital section of the game, but because the levels are so well designed, I actually didn't lose my way all too much, and in fact, not having the map probably helped me to learn the level layout a lot better than what I would have with the map. But where does the horror come in, I hear you ask? Well, the horror mostly comes down to the visual design and the sound design. Upon reaching a certain point in each level, the world will transform into the other world. This is like the more sinister side of Silent Hill, acting almost like a mirror image of the normal world, but where there's more enemies, elements of the environment are laid out differently, and most importantly, rust, blood, strung up corpses, and strange cultist icons are all over the place. The sound design here really ramps up too, and certain tracks famously utilise the distorted sound of a dentist drill, which is an effective but very unorthodox instrument for a soundtrack. Adding to the weird on-edge sensation you get when playing this game is that sometimes there will just be random noises and nothing ever happens with them. This is incredibly unsettling because we're conditioned to always expect a monster or something whenever there's a sudden noise. But here, that's used against you because the thing you're expecting never actually appears. There's tons of examples of this that really got under my skin, but one of the more famous areas in which this happens is here in this bathroom, where you'll hear this. And that's it. There's never a girl enemy in this area or anything, and it just gets your mind racing, thinking where did that noise come from and what actually made that noise in the first place? Was it real or did I imagine it? It's great stuff. But there's several other more subtle ways that the game messes with you like this. Don't be thinking that it's only audio trickery, because it has a lot more than that up its sleeve. Like this bit where you'll enter a first floor bathroom and there's nothing there, so you exit and you find yourself outside the bathroom again, but something's different. There's a fence blocking you in where there wasn't a fence before. I figured that maybe I went out a second door in the bathroom or something, but then later I realised I was in the second floor bathroom. It's like the world had shifted and somehow teleported me up a floor when I went through the bathroom door. Then there's also this bit which I loved, where you get into an elevator and explore each of the 3 floors of the hospital, but then you come to a dead end. So obviously you get back into the elevator to find this. Yep, a 4th floor has now appeared. But wait, maybe it was there all along and I just didn't see it? And that's the sort of stuff that Silent Hill is pulling on you all the time, and it makes the areas you explore even more disorientating and far more scary than they would otherwise be. It's like the town itself is against you somehow. Another thing that makes exploring so great is that the graphics are absolutely incredible, and each location you visit is so visually distinct from the last. Even when the same locations are used, the game will change the weather or the time of day, or maybe even shift to the Otherworld version, which keeps things exciting throughout the entire thing. So yeah, I think at this point it's safe to say that I absolutely loved my time playing this game, and I would very, very highly recommend that you check it out if it looks interesting. But that isn't to say that there aren't any issues with the game though. The main problem with the game is something that I very briefly touched on earlier, and I would actually imagine that a lot of people would disagree with me on this, because it's a fairly subjective point. But despite the music and the atmosphere being scary, the game itself just isn't very scary at all. I think a lot of this comes down to the monsters, to be honest, because I would argue that there's far too many of them, so you eventually just get used to them, and the designs are just a bit stereotypical, I guess. Like, a lot of the monsters here just look like your average demon or zombie, and there's not a lot about them that stands out. You've got zombie nurses and doctors, you've got demon dogs and weird little demon kids, but none of them look frightening really. On the spookometer, I would probably say there were a 5 out of 10 tops, whereas the environments themselves can go up to either a 7 or an 8. It's the sort of spooky that looks more cool than it does actually scary, if you get what I mean. There's also a few boss battles throughout your adventure through Silent Hill, and these are, well, they're pretty darn bad. It basically just boils down to shooting them and running around a lot, and the boss designs don't really seem to have anything to do with what's going on. At one point, you're unloading your shotgun into a big worm, for God's sake. There's a bit of a strategy with a couple of the bosses beyond just running and gunning, but even then, it's a very minimal strategy, and I almost wonder if the game would have been better without any bosses, maybe aside from the final boss. A detail I did absolutely love about Silent Hill though is that if you die on a boss battle, you don't need to continue from your last save, and you can actually just carry on from the start of the boss fight itself. Thank God this is a thing as well, because when I came to the first boss, I hadn't saved in ages. Speaking of saving, another thing that I liked about the game is that save points are actually extremely frequent, and you can save as much as you like. So even if you do die, you normally wouldn't have to go back very far, and I very much appreciate that. The only other thing I would say as a main negative is perhaps a little bit unfair, because not many games of this era had anything like this. But I feel like it would have been better to have had a quick select option for swapping weapons or using health items. You'll probably be doing this a lot, and having to go into a menu every single time can break the flow of the game a bit, and I feel like if you could somehow cycle through your items in the actual gameplay, it might have even made things more tense too. because you wouldn't have been able to pause and take a breather while you think about what weapon to select, and you would have had to have done it there and then as a monster makes its way towards you. But yeah, at this point I feel like I'm being really nitpicky, looking for things to not like. So now, let's finally wrap up this video by taking a look at the story of the game. If you want to avoid spoilers, then go to this time on the screen now. You gone? Good. Then let's all sit down for Rob's story time, with me, Uncle Rob. Harry spends a while following breadcrumbs to find his missing daughter, which leads him to the school and his first encounter with the other world. He eventually makes his way back into the real world and bumps into a character called Dahlia Gillespie, who gives him something called a Flauros and tells him to go to the hospital. At the hospital he meets a doctor called Michael Kaufman, and later in the otherworld version of the hospital he meets yet another character who's a nurse called Lisa Garland. Before she can explain what's going on, Harry wakes up and finds himself in the real world again and meets up with Sybil, the police officer from earlier. She tells him that she saw his daughter going towards the nearby lake, and the two decide to go and investigate but get separated on the way, with Harry once again getting pulled into the other world. It's here where the major side quest of the game becomes available, and I actually did manage to complete this. Although, admittedly, once again I did have to look up one aspect of it due to me not knowing that this hotel had a back entrance, which you need to access due to the other doors all being locked. But hey, I did only look up 2 things for the whole game, so my challenge for next time is to try and do Silent Hill 2 with looking nothing up. Anyway, the side objective here involves you saving Michael Kaufman's life after he's being attacked by a monster, and then following his strange trail and discovering he's been transporting drugs or something. You then eventually find a red liquid inside a bottle which is hidden in a motorbike's petrol tank before Kaufman appears and then takes it off of you. After that whole debacle, you finally regroup with Sybil, and Dahlia appears and tells you to go to the lighthouse, but that your daughter is at the fairground nearby. So Sybil goes to the fairground and Harry goes to the lighthouse. But when reaching the top of the lighthouse, you just find a weird area where a girl who looks a bit like Cheryl disappears, and then you're left in a black void with cult symbols all over the floor. So you've basically just wasted your time, and I'm not sure what this whole lighthouse thing was about, to be honest. It seems a bit irrelevant to the overall plot, so I'm not sure why Harry didn't just go straight to the fairground. After all, that is where his daughter's supposed to be. So after getting sidetracked, Harry does then go to the fairground and finds that Sybil has been possessed and is attempting to kill you. Way back at the hospital earlier in the game, you came across a smashed glass with red liquid all over the floor, and apparently you could have put the red liquid into a bottle at this point and then used it to save Sybil. I didn't think of doing this at the time because how the hell do you put a liquid that's all over the floor back into a plastic bottle? It doesn't make much sense. But the end of the story is that I killed Sybil, which actually might be the canon event of the game anyway, although apparently there's some contention about which of these outcomes are canon, but we'll leave that aside. This is where things get a little bit sketchy. So the girl who keeps running away and disappearing on us is called Alyssa, and she's the daughter of Dahlia. She also has powers, and the reason for this is that Dahlia impregnated her with some kind of god. But in order to stop the god being born, Alyssa split her soul in 2, with one half being inside the original Alyssa and the other half being put into Cheryl. Alyssa was a part of some kind of sacrifice and burned alive in order to bring about the birth of God, but it went wrong and Alyssa survived, but with severe burns and in constant pain. And due to her powers, she basically manifested everything that we've been seeing in Silent Hill. So with the ending I got, Alyssa and Cheryl combine, and Dahlia reveals that she's been using Harry all along in order to get this god to be born because she's the member of a cult that worships this particular god. Then Kaufman suddenly appears and throws the red liquid from earlier at Alyssa, which seemingly kills her, I guess? But the god is born anyway and kills Dahlia before going after Harry. A few shotgun shells later and Harry has killed God. But before he leaves, Alyssa, who's dying on the floor, gives Harry a baby. Somehow. and he finally escapes Silent Hill with his new daughter, who was born from a lesser. Look, towards the end of the game I kinda lost track a little bit about what the hell was going on here, and even now when I feel like I have a basic grasp of what's happening, I feel like I have way more questions than answers. Like, what the hell was going on with Kaufman? Why was he transporting drugs, and what was his relationship with Lisa the nurse? At the end, Lisa suddenly appears and seemingly kills Kaufman, so I'm not sure what's going on there. To be honest, I probably missed a lot of background information. Plus, I'm a little bit hazy on why exactly Harry was given a baby at the end and where it came from. Like, did a lesser give birth to a bad entity, which was the god, and also a good entity, which was the baby, due to her being a combination of a lesser and Cheryl, which could be considered the good and evil sides of the soul? I'm not sure, but it's given me a lot to think about, which is what all good horror does. I am a little bit disappointed with how the game becomes all about a cult and gods, rather than the town of Silent Hill being the cause of everything that we see. I would rather it have been that the town of Silent Hill itself was tormenting everybody that got trapped there. I think having this unseen and unexplained entity in control of everything is much more intriguing and scary, rather than having this crazy cult be behind it all. But hey, maybe that's just me. And you never know, the town itself could have some sort of supernatural element to it in the later games, but to find that out, we're gonna actually have to play through them. Even if I think the story goes a little bit off the rails later on, I still think it's great, and I feel like on a repeat playthrough I would probably understand a lot more about what's going on, and I would probably appreciate it a lot more because of that. That isn't to say that the story is bad though, it just wasn't quite what I was expecting based on the second-hand knowledge I had of the series going into it. But regardless of what you think of the story, the graphics are solid, the gameplay is amazing, and the sound design is phenomenal. So these 3 points easily allow the game to carry itself, regardless of what other minor issues it might have. I'm putting Silent Hill in second place in my series ranking. I honestly don't know if I should really be considering PT as a proper entry in the series, considering it's a teaser for a game that never came out, and it's also not even playable anymore. Also, there's the fact that I reviewed PT outside of this Silent Hill marathon, which will probably be a bit confusing. And there's also the aspect to consider that PT is so different to these other Silent Hill games that they're hardly comparable, really. But still, PT is so good that I feel like I should count it regardless of all of those things. Even though Silent Hill is second, that by no means makes it bad though. As you can probably tell by how much I've been going on about it, this game is absolutely fantastic. I've been making a lot of comparisons between Silent Hill and Resident Evil throughout the video, and I can honestly say that for me, Silent Hill is superior to any of the 3 original Resident Evil games. It's scarier, it's more ambitious, it has a lot more going on with its combat mechanics. The graphics are much more my cup of tea, with them being more stylized with things like the moving camera angles. And the soundtrack is phenomenal. Silent Hill is not only the best horror game I've played on PS1, but it's also one of the best horror games I've ever played in general. If you, like me before making this video, haven't played through this and you like the idea or the look of it, you seriously owe it to yourself to check it out. So, where do we go from here? Well, of course, with the success of the original game, the developers went straight to creating a sequel with Silent Hill 2 for the PS2. I've heard a lot of good things about this game, with a lot of people saying that it's not only one of the best horror games, but also one of the best video games in general ever made. So I'm going into this with very high expectations, especially considering that the first game was so good. So until next time, where we'll be taking a look at this, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, give it a like, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and leave a comment down below letting me know what your favourite game in the Silent Hill series is. And until next time,